Welcome to another episode of Judgment Day. We've been doing these programs for some while now, since the beginning of lockdown, and the initial purpose of them was to help you through the lockdown by looking at both the legal, medical, and, if you wish, economic bases of the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic for our country and the world, and trying to help people through what's been an unprecedentedly difficult time. As we've moved on to lockdown level 1, we focused our attention more, certainly in the last couple of weeks, on the economy and the recovery from the obvious implications that COVID-19 has caused to the economy. And today, really delighted to have Professor Michael Sachs from Wits University Center of Inequality Studies, who of course had a long and extremely distinguished career at Treasury. Indeed, let me be perfectly blunt, I wasn't the only one who was desperately sorry when he left Treasury because he was so good. But there we are. But Wits's gain is unquestionably the Treasury's loss. So, Michael, thank you for doing this. And I wonder whether I could start by asking you what your reaction was to the President's recovery plan of last week.
Well, I think like most people, I was underwhelmed. I think that, quite frankly, we've reached the point where we should have realized by now a speech is not the thing. I don't think there's any speech that anyone can make that will change the course of our history. We want to see the action. In terms of the way the thing was conceptualized, I think the main flaw is that government still appears to believe that capitalist growth can be, is not fundamentally about private accumulation. I think they've realized that private accumulation is the basis of capitalist growth. And they think that by the public sector doing various projects, they can stimulate growth, where really the challenge is to reignite the path of capitalist accumulation, which requires private sector investment.
So if you had been crafting the speech for the President, I accept that speeches don't say very much, you're right, talk is cheap, money buys the whiskey, but the real question I suppose I'm asking is, what would your focus then have been on?
So I think that, the other kind of big problem with our policy frameworks is that we attempt to accommodate everything. I think there's one or two critical issues that we need to focus on to revive growth. And the first and most important one is energy. And if we were able to articulate a compelling vision of transformation of the energy sector in a manner that advances technology in South Africa towards the cutting edge of global development, which is green technology, we would be setting out a powerful narrative and a powerful framework within which to mobilize private investment, and that would require transformation of the economy. So I would have kind of said, don't focus on everything, just focus on energy. And maybe one or two other sectors. I mean, of course, you can't just focus on one thing, but instead, I find it's very dispersed, the focus, and you don't get that sense of a vision, really.
But I wondered on that, just out of interest, I mean, he did say that we're going to move to green energy, and he did seem to put some timetable on it. Was that just, did you think that he should have embraced this in a more holistic way?
Well, so I'm just saying, as a speech, I mean, there are some positives that I see in what government is doing. There is progress, as you say, around in the energy sector. There is progress. It does appear on broadband and all of these things that we've been talking about for so many years. So on the one hand, you want to see the money, as you put it, or you want to see the action, but also you want to have a sense that. See, at the moment, the sense is that, yes, we are doing these things because business has told us to. And we've then negotiated a painful compromise within the ANC between people who are supporting kind of old energy, big industry models on the one hand, and various factions have then acceded to this small reform. right? Okay, that's better than nothing. But what you would really want to see is the moonshot, you know, as Mariana Mazzucato likes to talk about. Where's the moonshot? Where's the vision? Where that this is wholly owned by the president and he's going to push it and make sure it happens. You don't get that sense. You get the sense of a finely crafted compromise by people who are treading on eggs.
Now, but then what is, I mean, so I accept readily, I would be entirely with you that issues such as energy and the spectrum are vital. But where does that vision, what is the vision of the South African economy? I mean, how do we, bluntly put, start growing at a meaningful rate?
So I think that the key constraint on growth is about, or the easiest way to revive growth in the short term, let me put it like this, because here we're just talking about moving things forward in the short term. And I think you do need a restructuring of those large network industries. And unfortunately, in most of them, we have, most of them are dominated by one company that kind of this a behemoth that bestrides the entire sector, and it's a publicly owned company. And therefore, the challenge of transforming those industries or those sectors, those network, those foundations of growth, instead of becoming a question of reform of production and the organization of production, it becomes a corporate restructuring of this firm. And so I think I don't know what the answer is in terms of what is South Africa's, you know, vision. But I'm saying, for example, you could locate the reform of the energy sector at the center of industrial policy.
Yeah.
So you say, because what is industrial policy? Industrial policy for me, I'm not really an industrial policy person, but at the broadest level, it's about upgrading your technological structure and becoming more productive. So if you kind of have if the obvious constraint that is constraining the economy is energy, make it into a virtue. Use the resolution of that constraint to focus all of your efforts, whether that's industrial policy or kind of industrial restructuring and technological upgrade. And so you don't get a sense of a coherence, of a cohering idea that is driving the whole of policy. So you get a sense, as I said, of fine, now we're agreeing that we're going to do a little bit more of IPPs for energy, great. But on the other hand, people are pushing for big mega projects, and it's kind of a compromise. And maybe maybe it's unreasonable. Maybe politics in a highly divided, unequal society will always be negotiation and compromise and a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But I think after 25 years, it would be good to try something slightly different, because this one doesn't seem to be delivering the goods.
No, I take the point, but I take the point even further in the fact that if you looked at when we came into COVID, and I accept that the second quarter will probably be slightly regressed, but at the end of the day, on anybody's analysis, we're going to be in negative growth territory for the year, and we're going to therefore have greater unemployment than we commenced the year. So, I mean, the answer is we can't sit still. I mean, there has to be some serious grasping of the nettle. Otherwise, surely to goodness, we're just going to go even further backwards.
So, I agree. And kind of before COVID, what had happened, and the reason the economy was performing so poorly, I mean, I think I kind of look at it in two dimensions. So one is a kind of global dimension, which I think we're very bad at this country or in taking account of. So there were huge global headwinds to our growth that implied a lower growth path. And there's not much we can do about that, except you have to adjust to it. But we refuse to adjust to this reality. And we continue to base our policy agenda on the idea of a rising, expanding floor of social provision. So we didn't adjust and in a sense, we did the opposite. We piled more and more obligations on the fiscus. At the same time, you had a disintegration of the capability of the state. And that culminated in around 2015 in a collapse in investment. And it was a collapse in investment that was first the private sector and then the public sector. So we can't do anything about the overall conditions of the world economy, which define us to such a high degree. But we can revive domestic investment, and reviving domestic investment has a private and a public aspect. But I think that given the state of the public sector and the huge mistakes in public sector infrastructure investment that have taken place over the last decade, it's kind of, you have to revive the private sector leg of investment before you can, in order to revive growth. Yeah.
And why would the private sector are reluctant? Because there's policy uncertainty. They don't know.
Well, yeah, so that's the point. So, the private sector is a beast that follows profits.
Yeah.
And so in order to revive private sector investment, you have to guarantee them returns. And your guarantee must be credible, and it must give them enough returns to justify their investment. And you must ensure that you give them those returns over a long period of time. So whether that is kind of electricity pricing returns, so in the IPPs, that's what we're doing. That's why we're getting investment in the IPPs, because that's exactly what we're doing. We're guaranteeing the private sector returns, but at least in that case, the returns that we are giving them are linked to an expansion and improvement of our productive capacity. The alternative, which we seem to be going down that path, is to guarantee the private sector returns in the form of debt service costs, which are also credible and guaranteed over a long period of time, but don't really contribute anything to the expansion of the productive capacity of the economy unless they are invested well. And the big, I'm not against the public sector as a principle. But if I look back over the last decade, I think the public sector is in really big trouble. And a large part of the cause of the standstill in growth in South Africa is because of the failure of the public sector. So we need to, so in order to accelerate, to ignite growth in the short term, we're going to have to call in the private sector. And hopefully if a dynamic of growth does develop on that basis, we still need to bring the public sector back in and do what it does much better.
So there are two questions that arise, many questions that arise from what you're saying, but let me start with the first one. That requires a mind shift in the thinking. We still seem to be stuck in some sort of mad version of 1950s sort of state-orientated growth, almost as if Clement Attlee's still alive. I mean, aren't we going to have to change? Well, I mean, I'm old enough to remember the sort of Labour Party of Anthony Crosland and people like that. But what I'm really saying, I mean, seriously, is as you speak about that, a lot of people are going to, the idea of the private sector is like not good news for many, but the discourse doesn't sort of promote that.
I tend to think that these issues, when we discuss these issues, our starting point is always exactly where you started in Europe and the post-war reconstruction. Yes. and the social democratic agenda and all of that stuff and the question and it's as though that's the defining issue. But I don't think that is the defining issue in South Africa. I think the defining issue is a segregated economy, in which what has happened after 1994 is that the private sector, which remains overwhelmingly white in all of its dimensions, both employment and ownership, has been allowed to kind of go its merry way. And and because growth and investment have been low, the only way the black population that achieved political power in 1994 has been able to advance its interests economically is through the public sector.
Yeah.
So you have this kind of segregated economy, which is public is black, and and private is white. So when we then discuss the balance between the public and private sector, it's those dynamics. It's not about the working class versus capital. It's more about the racial division of South African society into these two different worlds that are unable to cooperate with each other.
So what has created that? I mean, that's a silly question, because pretty obvious after 300 years that should be obvious. But I suppose the real point I'm putting to you is that it does seem we're 26 years into democracy, and I mean, give or take, the private sector is pretty unreconstructed.
It is indeed. So what's the question again?
Well, I don't know what the question is. I mean, you're right. I mean, the statement as well, just sort of, it seems to me that the private sector seems to be satisfied if they can put some sort of high-profile black people into senior positions. That somehow changes the system. That in fact, running around looking for headhunters who are going to put some, and I accept, very highly qualified black people in positions is enough. Now, I'm not suggesting that shouldn't happen, but it doesn't seem that they've got any vision beyond that.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
No, I mean, but in a sense, I mean,
it's incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, it's incredibly frustrating. So there's look, I mean, I'm increasing. Look, I think so. We've been talking about growth, and I mean, right now our backs are against the wall.
Yeah.
In a fiscal sense, in the sense that the debt distress that we are about to enter, I think is going to be, we are facing the biggest macroeconomic shock, certainly since the transition to democracy, maybe even ever.
I'm sure.
In South Africa. We're facing that. And if that if that eventuates, it's going to be a very painful and violent adjustment. And the only way to avoid that in the short run is to revive the pace of economic growth. Because only by reviving growth can we restore revenue and make that net look better. That's the way to do it. But I think that the fundamental issue constraining South Africa's development is inequality and segregation. And I think if we don't address the issues of segregation, and by segregation I mean the social division of society into an affluent group, the two nations, if you like, that Mbeki spoke about many years. You can talk about it in many ways. And it's changed, of course, but it remains the fundamental reality about South Africa. And I don't think that we can have a path of sustained growth and development unless we get serious about addressing those divisions. So we have to find a way of forcing South Africans into a common society. And until we do, these divisions will hobble our attempts to grow and develop.
So if you had one idea about promoting that, what would you say it would be?
Well, I would say the most important, and here we're talking about, so one of the issues, I mean, if you listen to the debate about economic growth and macroeconomic policy, you'll hear people say, well, we need structural reform. But the thing about structural reform is that it means different things to different people, or different people, I mean, it means fundamentally different things. But all of them entail changing the underlying, what Marx would have called the base of economic relations, or productive relations. And I think that and that takes time. It's not something you're going to do in the wink of an eye, right? It won't revive growth this year, but it is the fundamental issue that you need to address to have a more sustainable path of growth. So with that long preface, I would say the single issue that I would prioritize is the spatial division of our cities.
Yeah.
Because you've got to find a way because we have to find a way, and I think we've been thinking about it wrongly. We need to think, when we talk about inequality, we usually have in mind the inequality between the most affluent elite and the poorest of the poor. but actually you could think about the integration of low-income workers. And low-income workers are relatively affluent because they have jobs. So relative to the whole population, they're not the poorest of the poor. Anyone with a job, when you've got 50% unemployment, anyone with a job is not the poorest. So how do you transform our cities so that people with jobs, black people with jobs, dominate the urban environment, rather than a kind of small, affluent white elite, which currently dominates the urban environment? Of course, there's a growing black middle class, and that's good. But how do we transform our cities and our suburbs to be more integrated? I would start there. And then I think other aspects of social policy are very important. So health and education. And again, we need to think about how do we get all South Africans into one system of provision of health and one system of provision of education. That's the core challenge, that bring everybody together. And that's the most difficult challenge, because of course it means the affluent losing some of their current position.
Can I ask you, you and I have debated this before, but I'd just like to share it with the public. Take education. I mean, we've debated this about the extent of the percentage which we spend on GDP on education and don't seem to get a bang for the buck. Now, I know you've got a view about that, so I just wanted you to have an opportunity to share that with a broader audience than just me and a few others.
So the argument we were having the other day, Judge
Yes.
Davis, is that,
and
thank you for the opportunity to come back at you after we disagree.
Pleasure. And I'm not going to say.
But basically, what I'd say, there's no doubt that there are massive problems of there's one primary issue in education, which is that we are putting in large resources into education, and we're not getting bang for our buck. Puts it for whatever reason, right? There's no doubt about that. So I agree with you on that, and it appeared like I was disagreeing about that.
No.
But that doesn't change the fact that reducing the resources available to education, the fiscal resources available to education, which is effectively what we've been doing over the last 10 years. And if the current MTBP, if the fiscal path put forward to us now is realized, that's what we will be doing. We'll be reducing resources available to education. That will result in an erosion of the quality of education, because simply the learner education ratio or the size, so you can have a fundamentally inefficient education system with a class size of average 30 children in a class, and you can have a fundamentally inefficient education system with 20 kids in every class. And the two will have different outcomes, I believe. And that's so I'm not disputing the importance of reform of the system, but I also think it goes back to what I was saying before, that I'm not sure whether we can have an effective public education system when, I mean, education is a bit different maybe from health, but when you have these segregated systems of provision, when you have islands of affluence that are essentially outside the public sector, in which the best teachers, the best resources, and the best students are all drawn into that. And then the public sector is left to pick up the burden of education in the ghetto. Because education in the ghetto is always an inferior education in every society, no matter how much resources you put into it. Education in the ghetto in the wealthiest society is still education in the ghetto, and it's still bad education. So you have to address that somehow. And that's, again, it's not a simple task. It's not something you can do overnight, but we need to begin thinking about how we move to an integrated education system.
And I'd like to debate that further with you, but because of time, I want to move on to something that you touched on. So the question of the expenditure raises the specter of the so-called austerity move. Now, it may well be that we're going to get next week a sort of an announcement about austerity because we can't afford more. And surely we can't afford austerity in the short term.
Well, I mean, the problem with the word austerity is it's one of those that kind of, it means whatever you want it to mean.
I know, yeah, fair enough.
So it's kind of, it's not a state of the world. It's simply so there's the, as I say, in my view, over the medium term, in the next year, 2, 3, 4 years, South Africa's position is so dire that there's going to have to be major fiscal adjustment. And that adjustment is going to have to take the form of that burden. It's a burden that's going to have to be shared. It's not going to be possible to simply improve efficiency or spend less on corruption or something like that. We're going to have to look at the package of services that government provides. And we're going to have to look at the taxes that people pay. And we're going to have to weigh the two and say, what's going to live and what's going to die. And so I don't know whether that's austerity, but I think there's an economic reality that we face. And and we can't sustain ourselves on debt anymore. So, but on the other hand, I think that the program that the government has proposed for this year and for next year is madness, quite frankly. I think it's a massive, what has been proposed is a massive shock, both to the economy, but also to social provision, that will generate an even bigger backlash. And I think what we need is a credible path to stabilization over time, that people can believe. Because the problem with the current program is that even the lenders don't really believe that we're gonna. It's not feasible. So we need to put on the table something feasible, that, as far as possible, shouldn't be about next year. If we can sustain some kind of aggregate demand through the government this year and next year, I think that's what we should try and do. But we have to recognize that that is only a short-term palliative, and that restructuring of the fiscus is inevitable. And we have to put on the table credible plan. So, and when I say credible, so if you were able to if the president could deliver a reasonable wage agreement with labor in the public sector that committed the unions over the next 3 years to a path of wage increases that is clearly, that is more sustainable. I don't want to guess what that would be, but in my mind, I'm thinking like a CPI or CPI, no increase above inflation, including all the bells and whistles that they have. And that there was an agreement around that for 3 years, that would be credible, and it would demonstrate movement in the right direction. And demonstrating movement in the right direction in a credible way is more important than putting up this big, short, sharp, extremely painful shock that is being proposed, which I don't think is going to happen.
So just on wages, I noticed, for example, there was reporting today that the Minister of Finance, in answer to the question in Parliament, said we could use the IMF loan to pay public service wages. Now, that seems a very strange answer to me. Surely we should be using it for infrastructure.
Well, I don't know. I mean, look, so remember, wages are something you pay every year.
Yeah, okay.
So you want a revenue source that also comes in every year to pay wages, right? So it's not, but you know, what the IMF loan is about 75 billion. The wage bill is about 600 billion. So it's,
I mean,
doesn't make a lot of sense to me either.
Well, maybe you can pay the increases, I don't know. But the point about what you've said about increases, as I understand it, is that it's all very well people saying you've got to cut the wage bill, but then what do you do with the teachers and the policemen and the medical staff, etc.? I mean, that would be, as I understand it, I mean, they're core areas, and you want to have the best possible people there. So you are caught in a dilemma, aren't you?
Yeah, so my argument is that first of all, the compensation budget of government has been very well contained for a decade. If you look, for example, at compensation spending by provincial government, it's been flat for a decade, hasn't increased as a share of GDP. So there's no, so sometimes you have this narrative of public sector wages are out of control and that's what's causing the fiscal crisis. That's not true. Public sector wages have been increasing by about CPI +2, somewhere in that region. I mean, it differs across different sectors, but they've been increasing CPI +2 for the last decade. And the budgets for compensation as a total have been flat. And so what this has done, because wages have been increasing, but budgets have kept fixed, we've been leaving departments across government with no option but to reduce recruitment and to leave positions vacant. So over the last 10 years, there's been a reduction in the number of teachers, quite significant reduction in the number of teachers. And this has led to rising class sizes. And this impact has been particularly strong in the poorest provinces, Limpopo and Northwest and the Eastern Cape maybe. So what we've been trading off, we've been allowing public servants' wages have been increasing, not at a massive rate, but much faster than the budgets, because we've been containing the budgets, and the consequence has been an erosion of the real value of the services that we provide. Because if you're a child in a class that is getting bigger, that is a less valuable education that you're getting. And so the question is, if you had an agreement like the one I was just describing with Labour, and that created space or generated some money, would you spend money on additional teachers? Because ultimately, if we want to grow, everyone agrees that kind of in a long-term sense, education is the fundamental thing. So the current approach, which is a massive cut to the education compensation budget, will probably, I mean, on the one hand, if it's accepted eventually or imposed on Labour, it will definitely also mean that class sizes grow in size. Because, and then I think when people talk about the public sector wage bill, you sometimes get the impression that they think that there's a group of people standing in a field somewhere in Pretoria who are getting salaries, and this is a problem. But if you look at the numbers, the vast bulk of the public sector salaries are paid to teachers, nurses, doctors, and police officers. So those departments, those sectors alone, that's 70% of the government wage bill, right? And then the 30% that remains is the home affairs and a whole bunch of other. So there are important jobs that public servants are doing. And yeah, so I think that we have to face the reality that if we are saying we cannot afford an education system of this size and we want to reduce it, that's what we seem to be doing now. That's the path we're going down. A better path might be to say, how can we get a more realistic wage process entrenched and use the space that creates to actually improve the number of teachers and also the effectiveness of the teaching system.
And much of that depends on a compact, which is what you're saying, effectively.
So I mean, we've spoken about compacts in South Africa for many years. They don't seem to really deliver. And there's a strong argument that compared to the 1990s, we have a much more fragmented set of social partners. Government is more fragmented, labor is more fragmented, business is more fragmented than it was. And therefore, these social compacts that we try to achieve at the apex never seem to really translate it to anything. I think if you took the public sector alone, where you have high union density and a single government in charge, we hope, it would be possible to have some kind of a compact that balances these things and provides a pragmatic way forward.
Okay, unfortunately, I've run out of time. As always with you, Michael, we'll carry on for a couple of hours. But you made so many points that I hope people will debate, both in relation to the public service sector and the debate, in relation to growth, in relation to between public and private sectors. As always, I'm incredibly in your debt. Thank you very much for the usually thoughtful and incredibly insightful remarks you've made. Very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis.